Good morning, everyone, and welcome to 1.5 Million New Homes, the Local Government Challenge, sponsored by Redloft and Lovell Partnerships and BPTW Architects. My name is Toby Fox, and I've been visiting, as some of you may know, a different council every month to ask what works and what needs to change to get more homes built. And during February, we were in Greenwich, publishing a series of interviews across YouTube and LinkedIn and TikTok and other channels. Now, those conversations covered everything from estate regeneration and partnership delivery to new towns and viability and infrastructure and skills and modern methods of construction. But stepping back, a consistent message emerged, not just from Greenwich, but from councils across the parts of the country where we've been interviewing. And that is that building homes is not a single issue problem, it's a systemic problem. Councils are dealing with rising construction costs and tighter viability and infrastructure requirements that run ahead of development, and fragmented land ownership and uncertainty around grant and long-term funding, and political cycles that don't always align with delivery timescales, and more besides. And increasingly, at least in this part of the country, many are saying the easy sites are largely gone. Delivery now means tackling complex infrastructure-led regeneration, and this is about long-term commitment, not short-term fixes. So today's session is about doing that stepping back and asking three questions. What has actually changed in housing delivery over recent months and the last year or so? What is genuinely holding back the next 10,000, the next 100,000 homes? And what have we learned, particularly in Greenwich, and what would we do differently? So to find out, we're going to meet our guests now who are joining us by a slightly unusual format for us. We're going to have three senior council officers from the Royal Borough of Greenwich forming the core panel throughout. And they are Alan Evans, who is Interim Corporate Director for Place and Growth. Welcome, Alan. And Rachel Bagnall, Director of Development and Regeneration. Welcome, Rachel. We're also going to welcome shortly Emma Sweeney, Head of Regeneration, who's struggling with our fantastic train system as we speak, but will be joining us soon. Now, at key points in the session this morning, we're also going to be joined by delivery partners from Redloft and BPTW, and look forward to welcoming them to the screen shortly. And also welcoming, audience, your questions throughout. Please put them in the chat, raise any reflections, observations or questions that you've got, and we'll try and feed those into the conversation. So we're going to divide this session into three parts, starting with what has changed in housing delivery in recent months. And Rachel, if I can start that conversation with you, over the last sort of few years, and particularly coming out of the recent cycles, what's actually changed in the conditions for delivering new homes in Greenwich, particularly?
Yeah, very good question. I think obviously there's everybody knows about that, we could talk forever about viability challenges and the impact of cost inflation, the sort of extreme cost inflation we've seen over the last few years, and how that's affected housing delivery. So I won't go into that because everyone's well aware of that. But I think it is interesting. I think more recently, I think there's been a bit of a shift. We were focused very much for a number of years on addressing viability, and that was related to cost inflation, building safety regulation changes, responding to that. And I think more recently, challenges with accessing funding. And when I say funding, I mean access to borrowing, particularly. I think for councils, more recently, pressures with HRA, borrowing capacity has really impacted how we are delivering homes, and has caused a sort of shift in the approaches certainly across London, and many councils have shifted away from direct delivery models and more to sort of partnerships arrangements. And there has had to be a sort of diversification of approaches. And I think one of the things that I think it's an interesting one, because I think there was a huge investment over the last decade, really, with councils starting to step up and starting to build housing on their land, building homes themselves, and actually doing a really good job, and building up the skills and the capacity in-house to do that, and variety of different delivery models doing that, but really kind of investing in teams and people and all of the infrastructure required to build housing. And building housing is really, really hard, especially as a local authority. I can vouch for that. It's a really hard job, and requires a particular set of skills and learning and development, etc. It's a huge investment, and I think for me, it's a real shame if we lose all of that because we can no longer access funding. And I'm sort of straying into future questions, but I think that that's my kind of big take on it, is that we've started off with a number of years ago, we were all responding to the sort of hyperinflation in costs, and we did lots of work on responding to that, or lots of people stopped delivering, and then on top of that, we've had this challenge with borrowing costs and access to funding and HRA capacity being sort of maxed out, or HRA accounts being maxed out. And I think that the combination of that, I'd really hope that we can find, and that's a way to address that challenge.
And that's meant, Alan, a change, that move towards partnerships and working with private sector partners and away from having that in-house capacity. That's meant a change in risk, hasn't it? That councils have had to take on board, a change in losing some control to an extent over the development process, moving from in-house to partnership delivery.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've shifted really in Greenwich from small site delivery across the last 5 or so years, being successful in that, but really taking the development risk. And although we were pretty sound in terms of how we were driving that small development program forward, there's been a number of issues for us. So some construction companies going under during that time, us acting nimbly. I think the pivot that we've done towards working in partnership, looking at some strategic acquisitions, has really shifted the balance in terms of how we're doing that. So we're not taking the development risk, but we're taking future risk as well, and we're looking at issues such as how do we maintain this stock that we're bringing in-house long term, and looking at those issues on that life cycle basis as well. So it's not just the risk we're taking now, but it's into the future. So it's been an interesting shift, and as Rachel said, it's shifting the capacity. So I'm a big believer in the right capacity in local government. It's not always there. I've had the pleasure of working for the National Regeneration Agency and looking into some authorities and looking under the bonnet of what engine they've got to drive like large scale regeneration. And some of those authorities you think would have a decent engine for doing that don't, and some of the ones that you don't think could do 1,000 miles on the engine are all prepared for it. So sorry about the analogies, but I think it's important that those skills are there. And I suppose just come back to your question, Toby, and that changing shift that in what we've done in the last 12 months or so, we've got to build that capacity, and there's got to be a different look at it now, so into the future as well. So those partnerships are very much here and now. What stock is available through those partners? How can we bring that onto our books? But also, what do we want in the future? So not just what windfall sites are, what can we do, what can we benefit from, what developments have started and we can take on, but where would we want that in the future, and where do we want to build? And particularly from a housing point of view, where do we need to see certain housing, specialist housing, extra care, for example, where do we want to see that? So it's been an interesting shift for us, and that programme that we're building now moving forward has got to have those skill sets in it, as Rachel said.
And how ready have the partners been to match your requirements? You talk about sort of need for specialist housing, for example. Is the market able to provide that?
It has been, but I think one of the interesting things is as development trajectories wind down somewhat, the industry, particularly developers, find it more difficult to pick up and run quickly. So there is infrastructure on site, there is skill sets, construction skills available locally. But if that drops, if that sort of tails off and there's been a bit of a hiatus, to pick that up again quickly when something comes on stream is really, really difficult. So that's what we're finding, I think, across the capital and up and down the country, is where that development trajectory does start to drop, picking up is not so easy, and particularly for us, again, as Rachel said, just having those skills available. We're a local authority, so we're tight budget wise, like anybody else. So we can't just retain staff just in case something comes up in the future. So we've got to program management. We've got to bring about our resource capacity in the same way as private sector developers would, or certainly RPs would have done previously in that development space.
Thanks, Alan. And Rachel, it's not just people, is it? It's not just the capacity, it's also the sort of policy that's has had to shift. How easy has that shift been, and what in practical terms, what have you had to change? Oh, you're on mute, Rachel. Someone had to be, right?
Yeah, it was about to be me. I think, in terms of I think we've had to change our approach over the last few years to respond to market conditions, as has everybody. And I think looking at, for instance, Alan mentioned, or you mentioned, Toby, small sites. I think we've, there's a land availability issue, and we've kind of lots of boroughs have really sort of exhausted those kind of smaller sites, those HRA sites, those garage sites, and also those sites are really hard to develop. Everybody knows how challenging that is, how to make those cost effective, and also deliver the numbers that are required. And particularly the viability issues have sort of even made that even more challenging. So I think moving to trying to focus on any larger sites and where we work in partnership with the private sector, to deliver those bigger, longer term, more complex regen projects that we've got. I mean, in Greenwich, we've got a number of those. That requires a sort of different way of working, as Alan mentioned, and a kind of diversification of approach and a different skill set, actually. And that's where we need to kind of build up that capacity in enabling us to be able to make those long-term partnerships. And I think the real challenge there is those kind of bigger schemes that will realise the numbers in the long term. Those require long-term partnerships, sort of long-term approaches to sort of 10-year plus in some cases. That requires funding up front when they're not actually capital projects yet. That's the kind of pre-development stage, requires investment, and there aren't obvious pots of money for that necessarily. Grant isn't necessarily kind of tailored to that kind of really kind of bringing those kind of opportunities forward, that kind of early stage work, which is very laborious, very time consuming, but really important. And bringing those projects forward, which will realise the numbers. And in terms of the 1.5 million homes, those big opportunities are going to make a huge contribution. So I think in terms of a shift in approach and policy, I think it's very important to look at how we can realise those opportunities and how we can invest in those opportunities as well as I'm not saying we should abandon small sites. I'm a great fan of developing small sites, and they play their role, but I think
the numbers are just too big at the moment, aren't they? And I remember Peter O'Brien at Hounslow saying, this would have been December 2024, I think. He said that what he foresaw coming was a real shortage of big sites because no one was developing the pipeline. Because of what had happened in the market, no one was looking towards the sort of next wave of regeneration and development, and that's precisely what you're saying is now sort of at our door, Rachel. So like, welcome your reflections on that, but also just digging a bit into that skill set, or what are the skills that you need that weren't part of housing delivery teams a year, 2 years ago?
Going to pick up that, Rachel?
Yeah. Or
yeah. And then you come in and see if because one of the things for me, Toby, since I've arrived at Greenwich, so I arrived interim director at the back end of 2024. So it's been an interesting 2025 and 2026, but we're moving more towards 10-year leases as well. So in that lease space, So not just the development appraisals and the project management skills and the development surveyor and all of those things that you would have had in the traditional team. We've had to sort of break out and look at, actually, what's our what do we need in order to move towards taking those long-term lease positions, and then that's a different skill set, but equally. And again, careful not to get my hobby horse here, but it's not just the development team or the place and growth directorate within the council. You've got to have those skills within finance. So our finance colleagues have to understand long-term risk, being exposed by some of the proposals that are coming forward, but then also legal teams as well. So we can outsource that, of course we can, but we still need that intelligent client capacity within the authority to be able to commission that outside support. So there's lots here. It's not just within the, as I say, place and growth directorate. It's across the council that we really need to think about the engine, the bigger engine to drive some of this, because there is a lot of risk in it. Probably to a certain extent more risk than just direct developing, although that became very acute risk, but there is more long-term risk and long-term financial exposure. And when taking leases, it can actually get to a position where especially if you're tracking RPI, you can suddenly become paying more for a development than what you're getting in terms of income. So you're going to have some exposure 6, 7, 8 years or further down the line. And that's one of the things that councils can't afford at the moment. We can't put that problem of the day back to tomorrow, because it will just be a bit of a nightmare into the future.
Fantastic, Alan. Thanks. And also presumably around partnership management. Just bringing in all of those partnerships requires a particular set of skills, doesn't it?
Yeah. And just before Rachel comes in, so the big thing, this shift for us is trying to have that look into the future. So we're just before Christmas, we got to Regulation 18 stage of our local plan. So we've now got a draft plan for the future of our borough. We're just taking into account the responses we had to our consultation for Regulation 18. But it's really helped have that longer term look and look at what the site development opportunities are longer term. But this is about place as well. So the knee bone connects to the hip bone. So we have to understand all of our borough and the connectivity around South East London to be able to understand what's needed. And then you can drive good place. Then you can drive well-connected places. You can understand what your employment needs will be and how you can respond to that. You can understand what transport connectivity issues you might face in the future. And then for local authorities as well, just as basic as we need to maintain these places, and we need to maintain these places well on limited budget. So what can we do looking at future technology, building in that into place development that really thinks through the next 20, 30 years? That's a lot for a local authority to do, particularly when we're just used to looking at development appraisals and now we can make it stack up. But that long-term look has got to be there. There's no doubt about that. Now, local authorities need to have that capacity and keep that capacity and drive that looking forwards.
And despite the need to be constantly fighting fires, right, which is the sort of emergency situation that councils so often find themselves in. Rachel.
Yeah, just adding to what Alan said, I think it's trying to build a department that has the skills as both being good partners and in long-term partnerships, and that is a very it is a very particular skill. But also on top of that, just why does it's about being a good client as well, and how are you a skilled client in terms of both being good at the kind of technical and commercial sides of being a good client, being able to manage the viability of long-term regen projects, and take a commercial approach, but at the same time balancing that with all the complex legal side of things. And on top of that, most importantly, is having that kind of big long-term vision for what you're trying to achieve, and that kind of real understanding of every decision that you're making and how that's going to affect the place that you're shaping and the homes that you're building and the quality and the design of those homes. So and that requires a very broad set of skills, I think, and a lot of experience and institutional experience, and also learning from mistakes. And I think what's really important is in the investment that's been made over the last decade in local authorities delivering housing, is not to lose that institutional knowledge as well, and that experience that builds up within an organisation, and that is so important to retain that, and to also to nurture that, and to promote it, and continually learn as an organisation about how to do things.
Thanks, Rachel. And you wanted to pick up on something, but also just to add something to that, in this kind of change of mindset, change of culture within councils, how much of those skills have you been able to kind of develop from the existing capacity, from people who are already there, and how much does this mean actually bringing new people into the council?
So the really good question. Because we've had to do that. We've had to repurpose people. We've had to ask people to step into spaces that they weren't previously. And as long as there's a base knowledge, there is a learning trajectory there, but there is also the need to bring in constantly, new skills. Because one of the dangers is to bring some professional consultant support on board, but doesn't necessarily always transpose into knowledge and capacity within the organisation. So that has to be so. Particularly since Rachel's arrived, we're looking at a learning development program in Greenwich for our staff. So that's hard because of the firefighting and the day job that you talked about, Toby. So to carve out space then to, for people to not just continue professional development, but look at sort of maybe picking up on new skill sets and applying that is really interesting. But I just wanted to make a plug as well. One of the things that we have as local authorities, this is a bit of a cliche, but our shareholders are our residents, aren't they? So we do have the skill set within our shareholders to look into the future. So young people and how we develop places is critical. We need to get that voice into the shaping of places for the future. And then also, ageing well in the borough is a critical priority for our elected members. So again, looking at where we build in the right type of homes. And that could be extra care, as I mentioned before, but could be intergenerational. We need to look really differently at the way we do make our investments. And as a council, as what our asset base is, we really need to think about, do we want to retain some of those assets, and do we want to use the capital we can bring in if we did dispose of some of those assets for some of our future places as well. So there's a lot of thinking, not just in Greenwich, but across the local authority base, really, that has been ongoing for a while. But I think now it's more important than ever, and we've got to make some key decisions around how we do fund some of this moving forward, because we can't go and do that much new borrowing, not just as Greenwich, but as the sector as a whole. We could get other people to spend the money and we take the risk, but then that comes with, as we said before, that comes with a significant amount of risk we're carrying into the future as well. So it's just a critical time for us to think about what next. And it could be a combination of everything. For example, the danger we've got in Greenwich is so many wonderful opportunities. So Thamesmead, Charlton Riverside, what's going on in Woolwich, finishing off the peninsula, as well as multiple sites across the borough. How do we do all of that in a 10-year period, if you like? But that's our challenge, and that's what we'll rise to.
Tens and tens of thousands of homes. Alan, you mentioned the T word, Thamesmead. So we got the announcement yesterday. Apparently, Thamesmead is going to be a new town, and everybody's sort of firing the starting gun. But it's not quite that simple, is it?
No. So it's a shortening of the shortlist. So the 13 proposed sites have gone down to 7. So we're lucky enough to be on that 7. We're really positive about the outcome of that, and taking it to over the finish line from a new town point of view. But there's some work to do now, working with GLA, working with the government on what the next phases are. So we're ready to do that, because it's an exciting announcement. That's a huge area of the borough that has significant potential. With the DLR extension that was announced in the budget last year, that was the first start, if you like, the huge piece of the jigsaw that we needed to start to complete the picture that is going to be Thamesmead moving forward. So we're really excited about the announcement, but there is quite a bit of hard work. It adds to our workload to be able to respond to that. But again, we will do that with as much energy and focus as we can muster.
Thanks. And we welcome Emma Sweeney to the panel. Emma, come and join us when you're able. Listening to the conversation, I'll sort of feed you in when you've got your feet under the desk, as it were. But we're just talking a little bit about the announcement about Thamesmead. Now, I've got two questions for all three of you. Just raise your hand and let me know who'd like to respond. One is, what still needs to be done in order to determine which of these proposals goes forward as a new town? What exactly is it that needs clarifying? And the second is, what's the timescale, as far as you know it?
So what I believe now to be the next phase is to consult, because there needs to be some significant local consultation within these places. So we know the potential of Thamesmead in terms of the land available, but we also know the infrastructure requirements, and we also know some of the investments that are needed just to prepare some of those sites. So we're lucky enough as the council to be working with Peabody as the main landholder and Lendlease as the developer. So we meet regularly with colleagues, but now it's stepping that up really and getting into the planning side. So again, go back to the point I made, Toby. We've made a commitment to be part of this, so we will be bringing in the resources and the capacity that we need to be able to do that next phase as it emerges as well, because I'm sure there's a lot more that I haven't covered to be able to mobilise as a brand new town.
Fantastic. And roughly what sort of timescales are you expecting to be operating to? When do you think you'll get to a point where it's announced?
Well, waiting further guidance at the moment, but I would fully expect there to be something because of what's needed to be done. But I'd fully expect to be something sort of summertime as the next phase. I think there's quite a lot to be done with the consultation that I anticipate that we need to do working with government. But we're waiting on that guidance and just stand ready to do what we need to do now with our partners.
Thanks, Alan. Right, final question on this part of the session is from Hunter Lydon. So, Rachel, Alan, Emma, raise your hand if you'd like to pick up on this. Alan, you were talking about being an informed client. So how are you going to make sure that these sorts of arrangements looking down the future don't become like PFI, PPP? And Hunter's really pointing at the sort of negative rather than the positive aspects of those agreements in another guise. Making sure we're not sort of reinventing a broken wheel, as it were.
Yeah, I think for me, and see what Rachel's got to add to this, but I think for me, Toby, I touched upon it because some of the PFI could become an expensive commodity moving forward, couldn't it? So we need to be really, really informed here, not just on moving quickly to bring new homes on stream, but what those new homes mean to us. So again, touched upon maintenance liability. If we are purchasing something that somebody else has built for us, we've got to maintain that to the degree that it's set out in any agreement. So we've got to understand those costs as well as what it will cost us to repay any finance or any long-term leasehold. We've got to understand the costs alongside that as well, and then understand what the market could do in terms of shocks, and then how do we manage that? Because what we can't do with some of that activity moving forward, if we get into those territories, is put any additional burden on our council moving forward. The HRA, the housing revenue account, is critical for how we build some headroom to be able to bring forward new stock. But equally, as I'm reminded by my colleague Jamie Carswell as well, is that we also need to maintain and invest in our existing stock as well. So, whatever headroom there is in the HRA needs to be sort of multi-purposed. And we need to remember that we've got to continue to maintain and invest in that stock and bring forward the new stock alongside it and maintain it, as best as we can to the highest standard we possibly can as well. And that just needs that investment. So it's looking into the future as a whole, really, as a bigger picture, not just the corner of the jigsaw.
Thanks, Ellen. And Rachel, same sort of question to you, but I guess with a twist. So a couple of weeks ago, a couple of hundred councils convened in Leeds under the guise of Southwark Council's campaign to secure the future of council homes. And the big call there is for reform of HRA, and an understanding of what rent is actually for. Alan's pointed out, you need it in order to maintain the stock that the rent is being paid, to live in. So should there be some sort of separation of funding for new build from maintenance of existing stock? Is that the key, do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's such a fundamental issue at the moment, and I think one of the things that an intervention that would really make a difference to enabling councils to continue building or to start building if they haven't started already is address that issue where HRAs are under so much pressure with existing stock, particularly in relation to building safety, damp and mould, all the pressures related to that. And enable councils, separate the ability to borrow for capital works for new build housing, and I think or just generally looking at where there are creating more opportunities for councils to access cheap finance, so to borrow cost-effective borrowing, because often we have a situation where there are actually schemes that are viable over, say, a 50-year period. They've got positive NPVs. We can build them and they are viable, but it's the accessing the borrowing the money to build them is the issue. And there needs to be that needs to be a priority, I think, for unblock. It's a huge barrier for councils to continue the good work that they started, some of them over a decade ago in building new homes. So I think there are some. I'm quite optimistic about the GLA City Hall Developer Fund, for example. I think that's looking quite positive in terms of what I've heard so far about it. But other initiatives like that would be very welcome.
What can you share about that the City Hall Developer Fund?
Well, that's a fund has been set up by the GLA, which is supposed to be a fund of money which is accessible to local authorities for either loan funding, grant funding, either recoverable loan or equity investment as well, and things like land assembly, also funding for land assembly. But the way the GLA have pitched it is that it's kind of quite flexible in the way it can be used. So if you've got a project that where there are you might need to borrow money, but you also might need grant funding, and you might need some land acquisition finance. It's a flexible fund, which I think would be really very welcome, and that is due to be launched imminently by GLA.
Now, this is sort of, the GLA is a sort of mirror image of Homes England to an extent, isn't it? And for London, and what we're hearing from Homes England from the Housing Bank that is supposed to come on stream in April is that low cost finance will be available to the private sector, to RPs, but not to councils. So, has the GLA got a different outlook? Is it able to offer this at low cost or below market rates, or are you going to be stuck with market rates on the loans?
Apparently lower cost. I haven't seen the details yet, but I think that was really frustrating for us, the Housing Bank, when we found out. I was really optimistic about that being a potential source of sort of cheaper finance for delivering homes, and was disappointed to find out that wasn't going to be available for local authorities. So I'm hoping that that the GLA stepping into that space in terms of the City Hall Developer Fund and other opportunities will become available to fill that gap, because that was a disappointment for councils that we wouldn't be able to access that money.
Thanks, Rachel. Now, Emma, I know you're going to be itching to comment on all of these things, but you're at a slight disadvantage because you don't know what we've already said. So what I'm going to do is ask Tom Conlon to join the conversation now. And Tom, could you, from what you've heard, can you pick out, in terms of the kind of barriers to delivery, is there anything in the structural barriers, in the funding, in politics and timescales and so on, that we haven't yet covered from your perspective, that's holding back delivery?
Hi, thanks, Toby. Morning, everybody. So I was going to sort of pick up on a couple of points, and I sort of go back to probably Rachel's point at the start, that development is really hard, and I think that comparison with 10 years ago is really pertinent. And just to sort of touch on the kind of great viability issue, 10 years ago, a social rent, capitalised rental stream for a social rent property was probably around about 130,000. Bill costs were maybe £2,000 per square metre. 10 years later, you might get 150,000 capitalised rental income, and bill costs have near enough doubled. So that whole climate has kind of totally transformed in that last 10 years. And alongside that, Rachel, you're quite right to point out as well that actually the local authorities have upskilled significantly in that time, have built teams that have delivered kind of great programs, and it's really kind of imperative that skill set is retained and continues to evolve. So I guess that's the barriers in it. We've now got teams where the capacity and the skill set are there in a much more difficult climate. So I think how do we kind of cross that barrier? And one of the things I kind of continue to think is always missing in when we're assessing sites, because that traditional viability model, most things aren't viable as we stand. So one of the additional skills, and Alan, you touched upon some of the skills that have kind of become part of that role. I think that skill of kind of making the case for development has become kind of ever more important for kind of in-house teams as well. And I sort of can never get over this fact, £5.5 million per day is spent on temporary accommodation, but that the savings against that never seem to be captured in the discussions about can we afford to do the scheme? And we've got to find a way to capture those savings in that decision making. And similarly, actually, with the kind of energy enhancements, and I think there was an announcement even this morning or yesterday about kind of new builds and levels of solar panels, and there was talk, I think, from a House Builders Federation about it's going to add 10,000 extra cost. But yet, what about the kind of the impact that does on kind of fuel poverty and helping people out of that? So I think bringing those factors into decision making more kind of formally, because I think in the sort of HRA capacity discussion, they don't really get captured. So for me, that's probably the kind of the single biggest thing I would like to see to kind of ensure we can continue to sort of upskill, continue to keep those teams, and continue to sort of develop over long term.
Great, thanks, Tom. Emma, Rachel, I'll come to you in a second, and Alan, but Emma, you're nodding away and we haven't heard from you yet. So what are your reflections on what you've heard there about how we unlock viability through making a different value judgments, really?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think the Green Book valuation starts to sort of suggest ways that we can do that. I don't know that we've sort of built that into the way that we approach development fully. And I think there's a great opportunity to do that, which I would absolutely welcome. I think we don't necessarily see sort of the financial benefit on the wider place, and we don't assess that perhaps in a way that could be really valuable, certainly for councils.
Have you seen it done anywhere?
Not off the top of my head. I would say that we like Red Book.
Yeah. Well, no one gets fired for hiring IBM, right? You do what you're told to do, and
That's
and
right.
There's only so cross that anyone can get. Rachel, and then Alan.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Tom's points, and they were well made, and also Emma as well. I think that we need to find a way of capturing that wider value of building good quality housing and improving places through regeneration, and it needs to be beyond, obviously there's the kind of can we get a break-even position with an MPV? Is there's first hurdle. A lot of the time, no is the answer to that, especially in current market conditions. And then beyond that, how can we capture or measure the longer term values? That there are sort of metrics in terms of sort of socioeconomic improvements, health and well-being of residents, the reduction in the TA bill is quite an easy thing to capture in things like if you're building supported housing, or extra care housing as well, different types of housing, the reduction in cost to the council, the cost burden of those kind of the challenges that we're experiencing as a council. So I think that's a challenge to all of us who work in delivering housing, and it should really be something we try and lots of different people have tried to crack this, but I think we need to be able to justify building housing, because sometimes it comes at it's not going to be cost neutral. It will cost upfront. It will have a cost, but we need to be able to justify that with that like long-term value beyond just initial pounds. And that's not an easy thing to do. And we have to be, in terms of a sort of leadership role, is a key part of trying to make sure these projects happen, is making that compelling case and building that picture. And that requires need to be able to articulate that and in a very compelling and we need to be able to sell what we're doing.
It seems to be sort of wrapped up with that an understanding of housing as an investment rather than a cost, right? That we have to understand it as an asset, and that would change the whole way that we provide funding for housing.
And housing as infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly.
Social infrastructure. Yeah.
Which I remember David Luntz calling for.
Yeah.
15 years ago now.
Yeah.
So this isn't new, right? Alan.
Thanks, Toby. Just probably, I'm majority of my career spent working in the north, up north, so therefore developers couldn't afford to build in certain areas because there just wasn't a return, and therefore there had to be lots of viability grant given, or the development didn't happen. But then there's a way of the public sector intervening, but it's really understanding where you need to intervene on that trajectory, on that value trajectory, because if you can intervene here and then it just starts to lift, then it starts to provide a case that doesn't need lots of grant funding and everything else, but it's really understanding that and seeing the value of the council doing that, not just on the appraisal for the scheme, but what it might create that long term. And I think that long term view on value, on the value trajectory is, and local authorities don't do that, even in North. Local authorities don't do that enough, because it has to be, because we work on short term grant cycles as well. Most grants are 4 years. So if you can't build past that 4 year period if you're in a process somewhere along the way. So a local authority using its covenants, just some whatever it does, whether that's the infrastructure investment, whether that is a early phase investment in one of the developments, but just seeing what it could do and then sticking to it, because too many authorities do it and then pull out and move on to something else, or priorities change, and then that value uplift doesn't happen, and therefore you're left with a deficit at the end of it. You've got to stick to that, say what you mean basically, and have that long-term view. And I think if local authorities can start to do that in some places, then that value trajectory will start to become more of a recognised tool in the box.
Thanks, Alan. And Emma, I remember you telling me about the sort of smart ways that you would activate Charlton Riverside, one of the next great regeneration and housing opportunities for London. You were talking about what you've got to do on a fairly small scale in order to start getting that to look like a different proposition.
Some of those sort of early meanwhile interventions to start sort of creating, I guess, interest in a place that I think will reap rewards long term. Again, there's something that the council could absolutely start funding at a reasonably small scale. Still takes, I suppose, that long-term belief, not dissimilar to sort of that Green Book valuation point, that this is actually going to get us to this fabulous neighbourhood.
Give us an example of what you might do at a place like Charlton Riverside and the impact that it might have on the market and viability.
Yeah, I think we're sort of assessing our kind of infrastructure offer down there, very simply in our condition of the roads and parking controls. We also just launched a project looking at how the Thames Path could be improved as a walkway, and I think that creates an interest, a buzz, a nice place to be that incrementally, I suppose, that permeates into the developer market as well. Well, that's the hope anyway.
But it's a long process, right? As Alan
Yeah,
pointed out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's sort of a challenge with lots of our projects, that we're not looking at sort of 5-year trajectory, rather a generational project, probably.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Okay, now I'm going to move the conversation on to my favourite bit of this sort of session, which is lessons learned. So what would we have done differently, rather than what will we do differently, if only we'd known. And this is the part of the conversation that calls for a bit of honesty, really, but is most helpful, I think, for colleagues in learning lessons from other places as we move forward. And I'm going to welcome Chloe Phelps to the conversation from BPTW. Chloe, do you want to kick us off on this part of the conversation? It's a little bit unfair to just throw you in and say, right, what did you do wrong? But with in the spirit of learning, how have you seen the way in which you design places, and with a particular view on Charlton Riverside, I guess, how the needs of that place change over time, and how your approach to design has to evolve?
So, yeah, hi everyone. I'm Chloe Phelps. I'm an architect and director at BPTW. I guess, yeah, I mean, in terms of, regeneration takes a really long time. I think we all know that. I think, looking at kind of some of the projects in Greenwich, I'm a resident in Greenwich. I work in Greenwich, and, looking at Kidbrooke, for example, I worked on that as a master plan scheme probably more than 20 years ago, and it's still being built now, and kind of phases are going into planning, and that's quite an amazing thing to sit back and reflect on. But also, BPTW's worked on some project, a project in Charlton Riverside, which is now being completed, and it's quite an interesting thing that I think it went through. I mean, I wasn't there when it happened, when it was starting, but that project is it was only consented on appeal because there wasn't a plan for the future regeneration in place. And so it's 100% affordable homes on a site right in the heart of Charlton Riverside, and it's an amazing thing that it's still, the plans and the master plan for that are still coming forward today. And I think, taking our, just reflecting on other regeneration projects that we're involved in, there's one that's due to be finished imminently in a neighbouring borough. So sorry to use a neighbouring borough, Preston, but Lewisham and Parkside. That scheme's been going for, I think, more than a decade with Peabody. And the final phase has been completed, and it's just the landscaping that needs to happen. And it's, everything has happened through that project. It's, we've gone through COVID, we've gone through Building Safety Act changes, gone through various viability crunches. The very last phase, the contractor has gone bust. And the one thing that we need to know is to expect the unexpected. You just don't know what's going to happen. And I think the other thing that kind of becomes kind of quite apparent in these long-term regeneration things is that the people who are around the table at the very beginning, from whether it's a contractor, whether it's on the council side, whether it's the design team, those people regularly change, and the common thread that runs throughout is the community, and they will change as well. But I think they become kind of the key kind of thread in terms of what is needed at the beginning, and then what and kind of can be the measure that you then work together with them to test the quality and, whether it's a successful place throughout.
So using that scheme as an example, Chloe, what would you have done differently if you could go all the way back to the beginning, knowing what you know now about it?
I think, it's literally that, expect the unexpected. You've got to build in the flexibility, both in terms of time and plan, in terms of master plan. I think multiple phases have been redesigned and tweaked and changed, and more homes have had to be slotted in, more kind of vent shafts for fire safety have needed to be slotted in. So, and we couldn't have known that was going to happen. Even things to do with the building regs have changed in terms of overheating and daylight and sunlight impacts, and there's there's probably reams of things that have changed, and I think it's just being really realistic that you just don't know what you're going to come up against. And I think when you're talking to local, the residents who are going to be affected by those schemes, quite often there's the over-promising of this will all be done in 2 years, or this will all be done in 5 years. And the reality is that, you might be able to kind of set some thresholds for what you might deliver in the short term, but actually the rest of it is going to probably take a very long time.
So a managing of expectations. Thanks, Chloe. Rachel, when we were preparing for this session, we talked about land assembly and phasing. We talked about cost and viability discipline. And we talked about the sort of culture and the capability of the organisation, as well as the sort of small sites versus big sites as potential kind of learnings to dig into. Pick one of those, any one of them, and explain sort of what you've learned in the process of regeneration.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there. I think if I've got to pick one, I think when we met, I talked about the kind of shift in culture within an organisation to enable. I think when a lot of us started out our careers in building housing, it was kind of boom times. Costs were low. It was a rising property market. We didn't have the building safety changes weren't happening. It was more stable, and I think everybody had to adjust once the kind of hyperinflation, cost inflation started to happen, and we had to start changing design to respond to changing landscape and regulation. And I think that required a change in culture within councils. Sort of it's a learning and development piece is really important. How to sort of lead projects, navigate through all of that whilst still having a vision for building well-designed homes and good quality places, how to maintain that at the same time as dealing with all of these other challenges and pressures. And I think having that kind of being able to lead a project as well, and that's a sort of development management role through all of that, and not losing sight of where you're trying to get to. I also think there's one learning thing that really occurred to me listening to what Chloe was saying, and I think one of the things that I would do differently now is looking back is just never stop unless you really have to. Like once you stop a project, you stall a project because you think, oh, we're not going. Yeah, and say you get a tender return, which is way over what the pre-tender estimate is, and you think we can't carry on. So you stop and you try and address viability. And lots of us have been in that position over the last few years. I think, although that feels like the right thing to do at the time, I think losing momentum on projects is so damaging. Because I think you lose consultants go off and work on something else. You lose the kind of confidence in the project, and it's really hard to get projects back on board. And my experience is hold the line where you really can. If you really can hold the line and find ways of navigating through and keeping projects moving and keeping the momentum up. Because I think once you stall a project or you stop a project, it's really hard to get it back going, and you lose confidence internally, and you lose kind of skill sets. And I think that would be my big learning was keep going.
Thanks, Rachel. That's a great cycling analogy. I spend a lot of time cycling, and you're going up a mountain.
If you're going up a hill, exactly.
Do not stop. Just whatever you've got to do, don't stop.
Even if it's taking small steps, like even if you can't do the big things, keep it moving.
Great stuff. Thanks, Rachel. Alan.
Only really just to build on that, I think that is that's the saying of the week, Rachel. Keep going, because we've got a long week ahead, which is some of the stuff that we're doing, Toby. But I think it comes back to what I was saying before. I just wanted to reiterate the point really. And you might keep going on a project, but it's got to be that long termism. Why are you doing it? What's the next phase? What's the phase after that? How do you commit to that? Because once you maybe do one phase and you don't do another, again, value is lost. So it might cost the council later down the line. It really is just keeping going, as Rachel said. But for so many reasons, and not, we're building value here. We're building the conditions that somebody else will come in and work alongside us. It's not just the council doing it on its own, it's doing it in partnership, but we also want to stimulate the market for it. So these are really tough sites, as you said at the beginning, Toby. They're the easy ones have gone. These are the really tough ones, and there's a reason why they've been left blank or left undone for the last 30 years. So we've got to start and keep going, but that momentum has got to be more than the next 4 to 6 years, 7 years. We're talking about 15, 20 years here. Like Kidbrooke and Chloe said, let's keep going, because the results are just immense, and the value to the residents and everybody involved is just significant.
Thanks, Alan. But also, I appreciate that you weren't at the council when the project started, but that you've been involved in Woolwich in really complex regeneration program there. What have you learnt around the sort of sequencing and timing of decisions around development that will play into the Charlton Riverside and the Thames Meads and the schemes coming forward?
Careful how I answer this, because I could, I will keep it a brief answer, but I think it's that sequencing, that sort of knee bone connects to the hip bone, really understanding how a place connects to the wider area. So Woolwich is classic, because you've got the town centre, which we invested Future High Streets Fund in, which is looking really good, and it's up for a Pineapple Award, I think, to come. I don't think we've past that award ceremony yet, but and then we just completed the leisure centre, which formally opened at the weekend. So a really big investment into the town centre, and then our development with our partnership with the Hill Group is just about to start on site as well. But it's just understanding that how does this link into the trajectory that Barclays have found at Royal Arsenal? How do we address some of the constraints that the big road runs through Woolwich town centre, the dual carriageway? How do we really start to connect pieces together? So that's again that longer term vision, but also that bigger picture. And that's what we're doing with the urban regeneration framework. So I think lesson learned that this can't be transactional, it can't be piecemeal. You get a patchwork result. This has got to be really joined up, and it's got to be you've really got to understand if you do put that another cycling analogy, isn't it? If you do put the weight on one particular knee, what impact is that going to have on the rest of the body on that ride? It really is just trying to understand what that longer term vision is and sticking to it, as Rachel said.
Thanks. Thanks, Alan.
Adjust on the way, but stick to it and drive it.
No, thanks for that, and congratulations on getting the leisure centre open as well. So it's another massive milestone. Well done, Chloe.
Ready? I just can't agree more with just keeping going on sites, as Rachel was just saying. But the other thing, just lessons learned from my point of view, just kind of adding to what I was saying before, was I think we need to get much better at defining what quality is. And I think that kind of leans into what Rachel was saying a bit about kind of housing as infrastructure. But there's 5 things in my mind, and it's every time you think about it, it needs to add value to the scheme, and it's designing it for kind of longevity and robustness, designing for wellness and health and well-being, and designing so that it's affordable, so it reduces residents' bills, and that kind of ties into kind of the environmental side of things, and then designing for communities so that they feel like it actually represents the place that they live in. And then finally, it's kind of making sure that we get the density that we need to support the places that we're working on. And I think if you start to build a quality agenda around that, it's a much more robust kind of process, I think, rather than, I think, kind of the other things that people think that quality housing could be.
But of course, when the moment you start talking about the density that a place requires, then you've got to do what Alan was talking about, that sort of looking into the future and future proofing, because what looks ambitious now might not look so ambitious in 10 years time, when all the infrastructure is in and it's a living, breathing place, and you think actually we could have gone another 5-6 stories up and got more dense and supported more activity. So it's such a difficult balance to get right, isn't it? Emma, what are your lessons learned?
Really sort of adding to others' comments around that, keep going. And I think the impact on the community should really be referenced, that by stopping, I think that impact is sort of increased quite dramatically.
And the impact on the trust between the council and the community as well.
And I think that even if those sort of on the receiving end, if the interventions are small or in fact meanwhile, I think that is still keeping going, and this sort of layered approach to improving place is probably really rich and valuable in the end. So yeah, I completely agree with everyone else's comments.
Thanks, Emma. And Tom?
Just one quick one, Toby, on I guess the conditions to enable that momentum, which I absolutely agree is crucial. One very quick case study of what would Cambridge City Council have done around one of the authorities you visited, Toby. Working with them, we kind of created a cross-party member steering group, which actually kind of facilitated, I guess helped to future-proof if there is a political change, actually kind of taking the time early on to build that consensus across parties. That's the sort of practical thing that certainly kind of help the team there. And it's that type of action, I think, just facilitates momentum when those difficult moments come in a project, to say.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. And we may see a lot of that cross-party work in councils across the land after May, not necessarily in prediction of political change, but as a result of it and all of the political mixes that are to come, but not necessarily in Greenwich, right? So I think I'm gonna draw to a close on the note of like, don't stop. That feels to me like a really authentic message from councils, every council that I've spoken to. Just that the mental strength to keep going in difficult circumstances is to be awarded and encouraged, and fingers crossed that things get easier for you going forward. And it certainly seems like the pieces are being put in place bit by bit to make housing delivery easier, but there's a long way to go yet. We're going to have to draw the session to a close now, though, and with great thanks to our audience for turning up this morning and paying attention, and in some cases joining in, but especially for our speakers for taking the time to share the lessons learned in Greenwich and explain some of the thinking to drive the next 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 homes being delivered in the Royal Borough. So a virtual round of applause to all of you across the internet watching. Thank you so much to Alan Evans, Rachel Bagnall and Emma Sweeney from the Royal Borough of Greenwich, and to our partners Tom Conlon from Redloft and Chloe Phelps of BPTW for their contributions today, and along with Lovell Partnerships for supporting both this webinar and the wider Greenwich series, which was a joy to take part in. It's been a really grounded conversation, I think, and an important reminder of why 1.5 million homes as an ambition still matters. We've got to keep in mind that every discussion about viability and infrastructure and delivery sits behind a real need and real people waiting for homes. So we're going to be back with a webinar with this month's featured council, London Borough of Southwark, as soon as the local elections are finished, and look out in April for our next series of videos featuring the London Legacy Development Corporation. But until then, thank you again to everyone involved in Greenwich for all your support and help over the filming and the webinar. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you, viewers, for your being part of the conversation.